The gunshot that killed Thomas Dawson echoed through Mineral Park, Arizona, on a blistering afternoon in July of 1882, and his widow Zelda believed that sound would reverberate through her soul until the day she joined him in the grave. She stood now at the window of the modest house they had built together with their own hands, watching dust devils spiral across the parched earth, her black mourning dress absorbing the relentless heat until she felt like she might combust from the inside out. 6 months had passed since that terrible day, when a dispute over cattle had turned deadly, when her husband of barely 2 years had fallen in the street outside the general store, his blood mixing with the Arizona dirt, while she screamed his name over and over until her voice gave out entirely. Zelda Dawson was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman who had aged a decade and half a year, her once bright eyes now hollow, her auburn hair pulled back so severely it seemed to punish her scalp. She had stopped going to church socials, stopped accepting invitations from the other women in town, stopped doing much of anything except the bare minimum required to keep herself alive. The garden Thomas had planted withered and died. The chickens she had once tended with such care now received only perfunctory attention. She existed in a gray world where color had been leached away, where every breath felt like an obligation rather than a gift. The knock at her door startled her so badly she actually jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She considered not answering, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time, and she forced herself to cross the small parlor and open the door just a crack. "Mrs. Dawson." Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat, his weathered face creased with concern. "I need to speak with you about something important." Zelda wanted to close the door, to retreat back into her cocoon of grief, but good manners had been drilled into her since childhood. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in, Sheriff." The lawman removed his hat as he entered, turning it nervously in his hands. He was a good man, in his 50s, who had done everything he could to bring Thomas's killer to justice, but the man had fled into the territories and was likely never to be found. "I will get straight to the point, madam. Your mortgage payment is 3 months overdue. The bank is threatening foreclosure." The words penetrated the fog of her grief slowly, like rocks sinking through molasses. "I have been paying," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she realized she could not remember the last time she had actually gone to the bank. "The last payment received was in December, madam. It is now June." Sheriff Bradley's voice was gentle but firm. "I am not here to cause you distress, but Mr. Pemberton at the bank asked me to inform you that if payment is not received by the end of the month, they will have no choice but to begin proceedings." Zelda felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This house, this small piece of earth, was all she had left of Thomas. They had chosen the location together, had planned every detail of the structure, had talked late into the night about the future they would build here. To lose it would be to lose the last tangible connection to the life they had been building together. "I will find the money," she said, though she had no idea how. Thomas had been the one who managed their finances, who made the deals that kept them afloat. She had a little money saved, but she suspected it was not enough. After the sheriff left, Zelda went to the small desk in the corner and forced herself to go through the papers she had been avoiding for months. The numbers swam before her eyes, but eventually the truth became clear and undeniable. She had enough money for perhaps 1 mortgage payment, 2 if she stretched it impossibly thin. After that, she would have nothing. The next morning, Zelda forced herself to put on a dress that was not black, though she felt like a traitor doing so. It was a simple brown calico that had been one of Thomas's favorites, and she nearly took it off 3 times before finally leaving the house. The walk into town felt like traversing a great distance, though it was less than a mile. Every person who saw her seemed to stare, seemed to judge, though rationally she knew most people were simply going about their business. The help wanted board outside the general store held only 2 notices. One was for a cook at the mining camp up in the hills, but Zelda knew enough about those camps to know they were no place for a woman alone. The other was for a seamstress, but when she inquired at the dress shop, Mrs. Henderson informed her with barely concealed satisfaction that the position had been filled just that morning. "Though I cannot imagine you would want to work, dear," Mrs. Henderson added with false sweetness. "A woman in mourning should be focused on her grief, not on laboring like a common shop girl." Zelda left the shop with her cheeks burning. She tried the hotel next, then the saloon, though she had to steel herself to even walk through those doors. The barkeep, a rotund man named Sullivan, looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. "I could use a girl," he said slowly. "But I do not think you are the type I am looking for, if you understand my meaning." She understood perfectly and fled back into the sunlight, her stomach churning. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Zelda had exhausted every possibility in Mineral Park. She stood in the middle of the dusty main street, feeling more hopeless than she had since the day Thomas died, when she heard a commotion coming from the edge of town. A group of men on horseback were riding in, trailing a large herd of cattle. They were dusty and trail-worn, clearly having come a great distance. Zelda watched with disinterest until one of the riders separated from the group and headed toward the livery stable. Something about the way he sat his horse, easy and confident, made her look twice. He was tall, that much was clear even on horseback, with dark hair that needed cutting, and several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. He wore a battered hat, pulled low over his eyes, and moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. Zelda realized she was staring, and quickly looked away, but not before the cowboy had noticed her attention. Even from a distance, she felt the weight of his gaze, felt something flicker in her chest that she immediately squashed down. She had no business noticing any man, not when Thomas had been dead less than a year, not when her grief was still so raw, it sometimes made it hard to breathe. She hurried back to her house and spent the rest of the day trying to figure out some solution to her financial predicament. By the time darkness fell, she was no closer to an answer. She lay in bed that night, in the room she had shared with Thomas, and allowed herself to cry for the first time in weeks. The tears came in great wrenching sobs that left her exhausted and hollow. The next morning brought another knock at her door. This time, it was Jake Morrison, who owned the feed store. He was a kind man in his 40s, with a wife and 4 children, someone Thomas had considered a friend. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, hat in hand. "I heard about your situation with the bank. I want to help if I can." Zelda felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "That is very generous, Mr. Morrison, but I cannot accept charity." "It would not be charity," he said quickly. "I genuinely need help. My wife is laid up with her ankle broken, and she handles all the bookkeeping for the store. I need someone who can read and write and figure sums, someone trustworthy. The pay is not much, but it might be enough to keep you afloat while you figure out your next steps." It was not pride exactly that made Zelda hesitate, but rather the knowledge that accepting help meant rejoining the world of the living, meant taking a step away from the grief that had become her constant companion. But what choice did she have? She could not let Thomas's memory be tarnished by losing the home they had built together. "When do I start?" she asked. She began working at the feed store the following Monday. The work was not difficult, just tedious entering numbers in ledgers, tracking inventory, handling payments from customers. Jake Morrison was patient with her as she learned his systems, and his wife Eleanor was grateful for the help, despite being confined to bed. For the first few weeks, Zelda moved through the days in a mechanical haze, performing her duties adequately, but without any real engagement. Then, one afternoon in late June, the cowboy she had seen riding into town came into the store. Up close, he was even more striking than she had realized. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and lean hips, his skin tan dark from long days in the sun. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling blue-green, like the ocean she had seen once as a child, before her family had made the long journey west. Those eyes assessed her with obvious intelligence and something else she could not quite name. "Help you?" she asked, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "Need to arrange delivery of feed and supplies to the Rocking Q Ranch," he said. His voice was deep and slightly rough, as though he did not use it much. "We are setting up operations about 15 miles northeast of here." Zelda pulled out the order forms and began taking down the details. "The Rocking Q? I have not heard of that ranch." "Just bought it," he said. "Been abandoned for near about 3 years, taking some work to get it operational again, but the land is good and the water rights are solid." She wrote everything down, very aware of his presence on the other side of the counter. He smelled like leather and horse and the desert wind, not unpleasant but distinctly masculine. When her hand accidentally brushed his as she handed him the receipt, she jerked back as though burned. "Name for the account?" she asked, not meeting his eyes. "Jacob Quinn," he said. "Most people call me Jake, but seeing as there is already a Jake who owns this establishment, might be best to stick with Quinn for business purposes." "Mr. Quinn," she said, making a note, "we can have this delivered by Friday." "Appreciate it, madam." He tipped his hat and left, and Zelda realized her heart was beating faster than it should have been. That evening, Jake Morrison brought her a cup of coffee as she finished up the day's bookkeeping. "Quinn seems like a good sort," he said casually. "Been in a few times to get supplies. Pays in cash, does not haggle, treats folks respectfully. Heard he used to work cattle up in Montana, saved his money, and decided to start his own operation." Zelda made a non-committal sound, not wanting to encourage the conversation. But Jake was not finished. "His ranch is in rough shape from what I hear. Going to take a lot of work to get it running proper. He has got a few hired men, but they are all younger fellows, not much experience. Quinn is doing most of the planning himself." "Why are you telling me this?" Zelda asked, finally looking up from the ledger. Jake had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "No reason in particular, just making conversation." But Zelda knew there was more to it than that. The good people of Mineral Park had been trying to nudge her back into the world of the living for months now, and apparently they had decided that Jacob Quinn might be just the person to help with that process. The thought made her angry in a way she had not felt since Thomas's death, a hot, burning anger that cut through the fog of grief. "I am not interested in being matched with anyone, Mr. Morrison," she said sharply. "My husband has not been dead a year, and even if he had been, I have no desire to remarry." "Of course not," Jake said quickly. "I meant no offense, Mrs. Dawson. Truly." She felt guilty for snapping at him when he had been nothing but kind to her, but she could not bring herself to apologize. Instead, she finished her work in silence and walked home as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold over the distant mountains. But despite her anger, despite her determination to remain locked in her grief, Zelda found herself thinking about Jacob Quinn over the following days. It was not romantic interest, she told herself firmly. It was simply curiosity about a newcomer to the area, nothing more. When he came into the store again a week later to adjust his order, she was professional and distant, determined not to give anyone any ideas about there being something between them. "Everything satisfactory with the delivery?" she asked, pen poised over paper. "Everything was fine," Quinn said, "but I am going to need to increase the standing order. Got 6 more head of cattle than I expected, and I am hiring on 2 more men next week." She made the adjustments, very aware that he was watching her as she worked. When she finally looked up, their eyes met and held for a moment too long. There was something in his gaze that made her breath catch, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he could see past the walls she had built around herself to the broken woman hiding inside. "Will that be all?" she asked, looking away first. "For now," he said. Then, after a pause, "You are doing a good job here. Jake Morrison speaks highly of your work." Zelda did not know how to respond to the compliment, so she simply nodded. After Quinn left, she found herself staring at the door long after he had gone, feeling unsettled in a way she could not quite define. July melted into August, and Zelda fell into a routine. She worked at the feed store 6 days a week, made her mortgage payments on time, and spent her evenings alone in the house that felt far too empty. She had stopped crying every night, which she supposed was progress of a sort, but the grief was still there, a constant ache in her chest that never quite went away. Quinn came into the store every 2 weeks like clockwork, always polite, always respectful, never overstaying his welcome. But Zelda began to notice small things about him, the way he was always gentle with the horses tied up outside, the way he spoke to everyone, from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest laborer, with the same level of respect, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was not often, but was worth noticing when it happened. She tried not to notice these things. She tried to maintain her emotional distance, but it became harder each time he walked through the door. One particularly hot afternoon in mid-August, Zelda was organizing inventory in the back room when she heard raised voices from the front of the store. She emerged to find Quinn standing very still, while a red-faced man she recognized as Carl Hutchins, one of the established ranchers in the area, jabbed a finger at his chest. "You have got some nerve coming into this territory and thinking you can just set up shop," Hutchins was saying, his voice loud enough to draw attention from people passing by outside. "That land you bought is adjacent to my water source. You try to divert any of that water to your property, and we are going to have problems." "I have no intention of diverting anything," Quinn said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel underneath. I have my own well and my own water rights. I checked all of that before I bought the property." "Those rights are disputed," Hutchins shot back. "My family has been using that water for 20 years. "Then I suggest you take it up with the land office," Quinn said. "I am not looking for trouble, Mr. Hutchins. I am just trying to run my ranch." Hutchins looked like he wanted to say more, but Jake Morrison had emerged from his office, and the older man seemed to think better of causing a scene in front of witnesses. He spat on the floor near Quinn's boots, a deliberate insult, and stormed out of the store. Quinn watched him go, his jaw tight. Then he turned to Jake Morrison. "Sorry about that. Did not mean to bring trouble into your establishment." "Not your fault," Jake said. "Hutchins has been a bully since he was old enough to walk. Do not let him get under your skin." After Jake returned to his office, Quinn approached the counter where Zelda stood. "Sorry you had to witness that, madam." "Are you all right?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she was surprised by how much she genuinely wanted to know the answer. Something flickered in Quinn's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or pleasure that she had asked. "I am fine. Not the first time I have dealt with men like Hutchins. Probably will not be the last." "Still," Zelda said, then stopped, not sure what else to say. "Still," Quinn echoed, and there was that almost smile again, the one that made something warm unfurl in her chest, despite her best efforts to remain detached. That evening, as Zelda walked home, she found herself thinking about the confrontation and feeling worried for Quinn. It was foolish, she told herself. He was clearly capable of taking care of himself. But the worry persisted, and with it came the uncomfortable realization that she had been thinking about him more and more lately, that she looked forward to his visits to the store, that his presence had begun to pierce through the gray fog that had enveloped her life since Thomas's death. The realization filled her with guilt so intense it was almost physical. How could she be thinking about another man when Thomas had not even been dead a year? How could she feel even the smallest stirring of interest when her husband's grave was still so fresh? She felt like she was betraying everything they had shared, cheapening the love they had built together. That night, she sat at the small table where she and Thomas had shared so many meals and allowed herself to speak aloud to him for the first time since his death. "I do not know what to do," she whispered into the darkness. "I do not know how to be in this world without you. I do not know if I am supposed to stay frozen in this grief forever, or if I am allowed to feel something other than sadness. I do not know if thinking about someone else makes me a terrible person, or if it is just part of being alive." The house offered no answers, only silence. But somehow, speaking the words aloud made them feel a little less heavy, a little less shameful. The next few weeks brought a string of troubles to the town. First, a fire at the mill that employed a dozen men, putting them all out of work. Then, a drought that left the wells running dangerously low. And finally, an outbreak of illness at the mining camp that had people worried about contamination spreading to the town. Through it all, Zelda kept working, kept existing, kept putting one foot in front of the other. She had managed to save a little money beyond what she needed for the mortgage, and she found herself thinking about what she might do with it. The house needed repairs, the roof leaked in one corner, and the front steps were starting to rot. But she could not bring herself to hire someone to fix these things, because Thomas had always been the one to do the repairs, and having someone else do it felt wrong somehow. It was Quinn who noticed the problem with the steps. He came by the feed store one afternoon in early September with his usual order, but after their business was concluded, he hesitated before leaving. "This is not my place to say, Mrs. Dawson," he began, and she immediately felt herself tense. "But I was riding past your property yesterday evening, and I noticed your front steps are in pretty bad shape. That is a safety hazard, especially with winter coming on. Ice on those rotten boards could cause a serious fall." Zelda felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and something like anger. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Quinn, but I am perfectly capable of managing my own property." "I did not mean to suggest otherwise," he said quickly. "I was just thinking that if you needed help with the repairs, I would be happy to take care of it. No charge," he added, cutting off her protest. "I have got lumber left over from work I have been doing at the ranch, and I could use the practice before I tackle some bigger projects." "That is very kind, but I cannot accept," Zelda said stiffly. Quinn studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her protestations to the fear underneath the fear that accepting his help would mean acknowledging that Thomas was truly gone, that she was alone, that she needed someone. "The offer stands," Quinn said finally. "If you change your mind, Just let me know." After he left, Jake Morrison came out of his office. "You should let him help you, Zelda." It was the first time her employer had used her given name, and it startled her. "Mr. Morrison." "Jake," he corrected gently, "and I say this as someone who cares about your well-being. You cannot do everything alone. There is no shame in accepting help when it is genuinely offered. Thomas would not have wanted you to struggle unnecessarily, and he certainly would not have wanted you to risk breaking your neck on those steps." The mention of Thomas's name brought tears to her eyes. "It is not that simple." "I know," Jake said. "Grief never is. But at some point, you have to decide if you are going to keep living or if you are just going to exist. There is a difference, Zelda. Trust me, I know." That night, Zelda stood on her front porch and looked at the stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky. Thomas had loved these stars, had often sat out here with her in the evenings, pointing out constellations and making up stories about them. She missed him with an intensity that still sometimes took her breath away. But Jake Morrison's words kept echoing in her mind. Was she living, or was she just existing? And more importantly, what would Thomas have wanted for her? The answer, when she was honest with herself, was clear. Thomas had loved life with a passion that was infectious. He would not have wanted her to lock herself away in grief. He would have wanted her to keep going, to find joy again, to embrace whatever the future held. The realization did not make the guilt go away, but it made it a little easier to bear. The next time Quinn came into the store, Zelda took a deep breath and said, "If your offer to fix my steps is still open, I would appreciate the help." The smile that spread across his face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I will come by on Saturday afternoon, if that works for you." Saturday arrived too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Zelda spent the morning cleaning the house, even though it was already spotless, changing her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue cotton that had been packed away since before Thomas's death. She told herself she was not trying to look nice for Quinn, that she was simply tired of wearing brown and black all the time, but the lie felt thin even to her own ears. Quinn arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, riding up on a sturdy bay horse with a wagon full of lumber trailing behind. He had cleaned up since she last saw him, his hair freshly cut, his jaw clean-shaven. He looked younger without the beard and impossibly handsome in a way that made Zelda's heart flutter traitorously. "Afternoon, Mrs. Dawson," he said, tipping his hat as he climbed down from the wagon. "Please, call me Zelda," she said, before she could stop herself. "Mrs. Dawson makes me feel like an old woman." Something flickered in Quinn's eyes. Pleasure, definitely, and something else she could not quite name. "Only if you call me Jake, or Quinn if you prefer, since there are already too many Jakes in this town." "Quinn, then," she said, and the name felt intimate on her tongue in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. He got to work immediately, pulling up the rotten boards with an efficiency that spoke of long experience with manual labor. Zelda brought him lemonade and tried not to stare at the way his muscles flexed as he worked, the way sweat dampened his shirt, despite the relative coolness of the September afternoon. They did not talk much, he was focused on his work, and she did not know what to say, but the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. By the time the sun began to set, the new steps were in place, solid and secure. Quinn stood back to survey his work, brushing sawdust from his hands. "That should last you another 10 years at least," he said. "Longer if you remember to treat the wood every spring." "I cannot thank you enough," Zelda said. "Please, let me at least feed you dinner. It is the least I can do." She saw him hesitate, saw him weighing whether accepting would be appropriate, but eventually he nodded. "That would be nice, thank you." Zelda had made stew that morning, letting it simmer all day until the meat was tender and the vegetables had melted into the rich broth. She served it with fresh bread from the baker in town, and they ate at the small table where she had shared so many meals with Thomas. It should have felt wrong having another man sitting in Thomas's chair, but somehow it did not. Instead, it felt like a door opening, like the first breath of fresh air after being locked in a stuffy room for too long. "This is delicious," Quinn said after his first bite. "Best meal I have had in months." "You must not eat very well then," Zelda said, but she felt pleased by the compliment anyway. "The men at the ranch take turns cooking," Quinn admitted, "but none of us are particularly talented in that department. Lots of beans and hardtack, not much else." They talked as they ate, and Zelda found herself genuinely interested in what he had to say. He told her about his life before coming to Arizona, about working cattle in Montana and Wyoming, about saving every penny he could until he had enough to buy his own place. He spoke of his dreams for the rocking Q, of building something that would last, of creating a legacy. "What about you?" he asked eventually. "Have you always lived in Mineral Park?" The question brought back memories that were still painful, but Zelda found she wanted to share them anyway. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her family's decision to move west when she was 15, about the journey across the plains that had been both terrifying and exhilarating. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social in Prescott, about their courtship and marriage, about building this house together. "He sounds like a good man," Quinn said quietly when she finished. "He was," Zelda said, and for the first time talking about Thomas did not bring immediate tears. "He was the best man I have ever known." "I am sorry you lost him so young," Quinn said. "That kind of loss changes a person." There was something in his voice that made Zelda look at him more closely. "You have lost someone too." It was not a question, and Quinn did not treat it like one. "My wife and daughter," he said, his voice flat and controlled, in a way that spoke of old pain carefully contained. "Cholera, 5 years ago. Emily was 23. Sarah was not quite 2. The revelation hit Zelda like a physical blow. She had known, of course, that everyone carried their own sorrows, but somehow she had not expected Quinn to understand her grief so intimately. "I am so sorry." "It was a long time ago," Quinn said, but they both knew that kind of loss never really became a long time ago. It was always there, just under the surface, coloring everything. They sat in silence for a long moment, two people who had both loved and lost, who both understood the particular weight of grief. Then Quinn cleared his throat and stood up. "I should be getting back to the ranch. Thank you for dinner, Zelda. It meant more than you know." She walked him out to his wagon, suddenly reluctant to see him go. The evening air was cooling rapidly the way it did in the desert, and the sky was beginning to fill with stars. "Thank you for fixing the steps," she said, "and for telling me about your family. I know that could not have been easy." Quinn looked at her for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. "Maybe we can do this again sometime. Have dinner, I mean. Talk." Zelda knew she should say no. It was too soon, and people would talk, and she was not ready for whatever this was between them. But instead, she heard herself say, "I would like that." The smile he gave her stayed with her, long after his wagon had disappeared down the road, stayed with her as she cleaned up the dinner dishes, stayed with her as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live again instead of simply existing. Over the following weeks, Quinn became a regular presence in Zelda's life. He would stop by the store to place orders, but he would also linger to talk, to ask about her day, to share stories about the challenges and triumphs at his ranch. Twice more he came to her house for dinner, and both times they talked long into the evening, sharing their histories, their dreams, their fears. Zelda found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both excited and frightened her. She was not ready to call what she felt. Love, that word belonged to Thomas, would always belong to Thomas. But she could not deny that Quinn had become important to her, that his presence brought light into the darkness that had consumed her for so long. The town noticed, of course. Mrs. Henderson made pointed comments about the propriety of a widow entertaining male visitors. The sheriff's wife mentioned in passing that people were talking. Even Eleanor Morrison, who had been nothing but kind, gently suggested that Zelda be careful about appearances. "I know you are not doing anything wrong," Eleanor said one afternoon when Zelda came by to drop off the store's ledgers. "But people in small towns love to gossip, and a young widow seeing a bachelor rancher is exactly the kind of story they love to embellish." "We are just friends," Zelda protested, though even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. Could two people who had each lost spouses ever be just friends? Or was there always that undercurrent of possibility, that awareness of what might be? Eleanor gave her a knowing look. Maybe so, but friendship can turn into something more, and there is nothing wrong with that, Zelda. You are allowed to be happy again. The words echoed what Jake Morrison had said months earlier, and Zelda wanted to believe them. But the guilt was still there, lurking in the background, ready to pounce whenever she felt a moment of genuine happiness. October brought cooler weather and the first hints of autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and the air carried a crispness that was a welcome relief after the oppressive heat of summer. It had been almost a year now since Thomas's death, and while the grief was still there, it had softened somehow, becoming less of a sharp blade and more of a dull ache. Quinn invited her to come see the progress at his ranch, and after some hesitation, Zelda agreed. She borrowed a horse from Jake Morrison and rode out on a Sunday afternoon, following the directions Quinn had given her. The rocking queue was nestled in a valley between two low hills, with a creek running along its southern border. The house was a simple wooden structure that had clearly seen better days, but Quinn and his men had been working to repair it. There was a new roof, new shutters on the windows, and a fresh coat of whitewash on the walls. The barn was larger and in better condition, and there were several corrals where cattle grazed peacefully. Quinn came out to meet her as she rode up, and the look on his face made her heart skip a beat. It was joy, pure and uncomplicated, the look of a man seeing something precious. "Welcome to the rocking queue," he said, helping her down from the horse. His hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary, and Zelda felt heat rise to her cheeks. He gave her a tour of the property, pointing out the improvements they had made and the plans for future expansion. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Zelda found herself genuinely excited about his vision for the ranch. He showed her the herd of cattle he had been building, the garden plot he was planning for next spring, the spot where he hoped to eventually build a proper ranch house. "It is not much yet," he admitted as they stood on a small rise overlooking the valley. "But I can see what it will become. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Zelda said, because she had felt the same way when she and Thomas had first built their house. She had been able to see past the bare walls and rough floors to the home it would become. The thought of Thomas brought a familiar pang, but it was gentler now, tinged with fondness rather than overwhelming grief. She realized, standing there with Quinn in the autumn sunlight, that she was happy. Actually, genuinely happy, for the first time in nearly a year. Quinn must have sensed the change in her mood because he turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Zelda, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "All right, I care about you," he said simply. "More than I probably should, given that we have not known each other all that long. But I cannot keep pretending that you are just a friend, that I do not think about you constantly, that seeing you is not the best part of my week." Zelda felt tears prick her eyes. "Quinn, Wait, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you are still grieving your husband. I know it has not even been a year. I know this is complicated and difficult, and I am not asking you to feel the same way I do. I just needed you to know the truth about how I feel. If you need me to step back, if this is too much, just say so, and I will respect that." The tears spilled over now, running down Zelda's cheeks. "I do not want you to step back. That is what makes this so hard. I feel like I am betraying Thomas by caring about you, but I cannot seem to stop myself. Every time I see you, I feel a little less lost, a little more like the person I used to be. I do not know if that is love or just gratitude or something else entirely, but I know that I do not want you out of my life." Quinn reached out and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. The gesture was so tender it made her cry harder. "There is no betrayal in moving forward with your life," he said quietly. "Thomas would want you to be happy. I never met the man, but from everything you have told me, I know that is true." "How can you be so sure?" Zelda whispered. "Because if our situations were reversed, I would want Emily to find happiness again. It took me a long time to realize that, to understand that holding on to grief is not the same as honoring the person you lost. The best way to honor them is to keep living, to keep loving, to keep opening yourself to all the joy and pain that life brings." His words broke something open inside Zelda, some dam that had been holding back a flood of emotions. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Quinn held her gently, his arms strong and steady around her, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Zelda allowed herself to lean on someone else, to accept comfort, to share her burden. They stood like that for a long time, two wounded people finding solace in each other's presence. When Zelda finally pulled back, she felt lighter somehow, as though she had set down a weight she had been carrying for far too long. "I am not ready for anything serious," she said, needing him to understand. "I do not know when I will be, but I want to keep seeing you, keep spending time together. Is that enough for now?" "That is more than enough," Quinn said, and the smile he gave her was warm enough to chase away any lingering doubts. As autumn deepened into winter, Zelda and Quinn continued to grow closer. They were careful to be discreet, mindful of the town's gossip, but they spent as much time together as they could manage. Quinn would come into town on Saturdays to have dinner with her, and sometimes she would ride out to the ranch on Sundays to help him with small tasks around the property. They talked about everything: their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and insecurities. Quinn told her about growing up in Texas, about the father who had taught him to work cattle, about the mother who had died when he was young. Zelda told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the brother who had died of fever, about the dreams she had once had of seeing the ocean. "We could go," Quinn said one evening, as they sat by the fire in her small parlor. "To California, I mean. See the ocean." "I could not leave Mineral Park," Zelda said automatically. But even as the words left her mouth, she realized they might not be true anymore. What was keeping her here, really? The house was just a building, and while it held memories of Thomas, those memories would be with her wherever she went. "Not right away," Quinn clarified. "But someday, when you are ready. I just want you to know that whatever you want, wherever you want to go, I would go with you." The casual certainty in his voice made Zelda's heart swell. This man, this good and patient man, was offering her not just companionship, but a future. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. December brought cold nights and occasional dustings of snow on the higher elevations. Christmas approached, and with it came the anniversary of what would have been Zelda's third wedding anniversary with Thomas. She had been dreading the date, knowing it would bring back all the grief she had been slowly learning to manage. But when the day arrived, Quinn showed up at her door early in the morning with a bouquet of winter wildflowers he must have ridden miles to find. "I thought you might want some company today," he said simply. "But if you would rather be alone, I understand." Zelda felt tears well up, but they were not entirely tears of sadness. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. They spent the day quietly together. Quinn did not try to distract her from her grief or pretend the day was not significant. Instead, he simply sat with her, held her when she needed to be held, listened when she needed to talk about Thomas. It was exactly what she needed, and she loved him for understanding that. The thought stopped her cold. Love. Was that what this was? This feeling of safety and comfort and possibility? That evening, as Quinn was preparing to leave, Zelda reached out and caught his hand. "Stay," she said softly. "Not like that," she added quickly, seeing the question in his eyes. "I just do not want to be alone tonight." Quinn squeezed her hand gently. "I will sleep on the sofa, if that is all right." They spent that night talking by the fire, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill. Quinn told her stories about his childhood, about his years working cattle, about the dreams he had for the future. Zelda found herself laughing for the first time all day, found herself imagining a future where those dreams included her. Sometime after midnight, she fell asleep with her head on Quinn's shoulder. When she woke the next morning, she was in her bed. Quinn must have carried her there, and he was indeed asleep on the sofa, looking uncomfortable but peaceful. Zelda stood in the doorway, watching him for a long moment, her heart full of something that felt very much like love. It was not the same as what she had felt for Thomas, but that was all right. Thomas had been her first love, the man who had helped her become the person she was. Quinn was something different, a second chance, a new beginning, a man who understood loss and grief and the complicated process of learning to live again. She made coffee and breakfast, and when Quinn woke, they ate together in companionable silence. As he was preparing to leave, he turned to her with an expression that was both hopeful and uncertain. "Zelda, I know it has not been a year yet since Thomas passed. I know you are still grieving, and I respect that. But I want you to know that I love you. I am in love with you, and whenever you are ready, whether that is next month or next year or 5 years from now, I will be waiting." The declaration took her breath away, not because it was unexpected, but because of how right it felt to hear those words, how much she wanted to say them back. "I think I love you too," she said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "I know I am supposed to wait, to be in mourning for longer, but I cannot seem to help how I feel. You have brought me back to life, Quinn. You have shown me that it is possible to survive grief, to find joy again. I love you for that, and for so many other reasons." The kiss they shared was gentle and sweet, full of promise rather than passion. It was a beginning, a commitment, a vow to face whatever came next together. January brought hard frosts and bitter winds that howled down from the mountains. The cattle at Quinn's ranch struggled in the cold, and he spent long hours each day breaking ice on the water troughs and making sure the herd had adequate shelter. Zelda worried about him, about the toll the work was taking on his body, but she also admired his dedication and determination. One particularly cold evening, Quinn showed up at her door looking exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were chapped and raw from the cold. "You need to rest," Zelda said, pulling him inside and immediately setting about making him hot coffee and food. "You are going to work yourself into an early grave." "Cannot rest yet," Quinn said, though he sank gratefully into a chair by the fire. "Lost 3 head of cattle to the cold this week. Cannot afford to lose any more." "You have hired men," Zelda pointed out. "Let them help." "They are good men, but they are young and inexperienced. They need supervision." Zelda knelt in front of him, taking his cold hands in hers. "You are no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Please, Quinn, stay here tonight. Get a full night's sleep. Your men can manage 1 night without you." She saw him struggling with the decision, saw his sense of responsibility warring with his exhaustion. Finally, he nodded. "Just 1 night." Zelda made up the bed in the small spare room. She was not quite ready to share her bed with him, and he seemed to understand and respect that. She brought him hot food and made sure he ate every bite, then practically pushed him into the bedroom. "Sleep," she ordered. "I will wake you in the morning." He was asleep within minutes, and Zelda stood in the doorway watching him the way she had the night after their anniversary vigil. Her feelings for him had grown stronger with each passing day, had deepened from attraction to affection, to something that felt permanent and unshakable. The next morning, Zelda woke early and made a hearty breakfast. When Quinn emerged from the spare room, he looked more rested than she had seen him in weeks. "Thank you," he said simply, and the look in his eyes said more than words could express. February arrived, and with it came Zelda's 25th birthday. She had not mentioned it to anyone, had not wanted to make a fuss, but somehow Quinn found out. He showed up at the feed store on her birthday with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Happy birthday," he said, handing it to her with a slightly nervous smile. Zelda unwrapped it to find a beautiful leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, Quinn had written in his careful hand, "For writing the next chapter of your story. With love, Quinn." The gift brought tears to her eyes. It was thoughtful and personal, and showed how well he understood her. She had mentioned once, months ago, that she used to keep a journal, but had stopped after Thomas died. "It is perfect," she said, standing on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Thank you." That evening, Quinn took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest establishment in Mineral Park. It was their first truly public appearance as a couple, and Zelda felt the weight of every eye in the room, but Quinn held her chair for her and treated her with such obvious respect and affection that anyone looking on would have to be hard-hearted indeed to find fault. Over dinner, Quinn became serious. "Zelda, I have been thinking about something, and I want to run it by you." "All right," she said, suddenly nervous about what he might say. "My ranch is doing better than I expected, but I realize I need help. Not just hired hands, but someone to manage the household side of things, to handle the books, to help me plan for the future. I was thinking, if you were interested, you could come work for me. I would pay you a fair wage, and it would give us a chance to spend more time together while still being entirely proper." Zelda considered the offer carefully. She had been working at the feed store for months now, and while she was grateful to Jake Morrison for giving her the opportunity, the work had become routine and monotonous. The idea of helping Quinn build something, of being part of his dream for the Rocking Q, was appealing. "What about Jake Morrison?" she asked. "I cannot leave him in the lurch." "I already spoke to him," Quinn admitted. "He said Eleanor is doing much better now, and she is ready to take back the bookkeeping duties. He would hate to lose you, but he understands that this is a better opportunity." Zelda felt a smile tugging at her lips. This man had thought of everything, had planned this carefully to make sure she would have no reason to say no. "Then I accept. When do I start?" "Next week, if that works for you. I have been fixing up one of the spare bedrooms at the ranch house. It would be yours, a private space. And before you ask, yes, there are separate sleeping quarters. I want to do this right, Zelda. No hint of impropriety." His consideration and respect for her reputation made her love him even more. They were taking things slowly, building a foundation that would last, and she appreciated that more than she could say. The move to the rocking queue happened on a crisp morning in early March. Quinn brought the wagon to her house and helped her load her belongings, which were not many, just clothes and books and a few precious items that had belonged to Thomas. She paused before closing the door of the little house for the last time, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. "Are you sure about this?" Quinn asked gently, seeing her hesitation. "I am sure," Zelda said, and she was. This house had served its purpose, had been the home she shared with Thomas, and would always hold those memories. But it was time to move forward, to build a new life. She sold the house to a young couple with a baby on the way, and used the money to pay off what remained of her mortgage and put some aside for the future. It felt right, passing the house on to people who would fill it with new life and new memories. Life at the rocking queue was different from anything Zelda had experienced before. She woke each morning to the sound of cattle lowing and men calling to each other as they went about their work. She spent her days managing the household, keeping the books, planning meals, and helping Quinn with the 1,000 small tasks that went into running a ranch. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way the feed store had never been. She felt like she was building something real, something that would last. And she loved being near Quinn, loved seeing him in his element, loved the way his face lit up when he talked about his plans for the ranch. They maintained separate bedrooms, true to Quinn's promise, but they spent their evenings together on the porch, talking and planning, and simply enjoying each other's company. Quinn was careful never to push her, never to demand more than she was ready to give, and Zelda loved him for that patience. April brought spring rains that turned the valley green and filled the creek to overflowing. The wildflowers bloomed in profusion, painting the hillsides with brilliant colors. One evening, as Zelda and Quinn sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reached over and took her hand. "It has been over a year now," he said quietly. "Since Thomas died, I mean." Zelda nodded, having been very aware of the date passing. 14 months. "I do not want to rush you," Quinn continued, "but I was wondering if you had thought about the future. Our future." Zelda turned to look at him, seeing the hope and vulnerability in his eyes. "I have thought about little else, if I'm honest. I love you, Quinn. I think I have for months now, but I was afraid to fully admit it. Afraid it meant I was being disloyal to Thomas." "And now?" Quinn asked. "Now I realize that loving you does not diminish what I had with Thomas. They are two separate things, both precious, both real. Thomas will always be my first love, the man who shaped my youth. But you are my second chance, the man who helped me find my way back to life. I love you completely, Quinn, and I want a future with you." Quinn stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. "Will you marry me, Zelda? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever life brings?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." The kiss they shared was deeper than any before, full of passion and promise and relief that they had finally reached this moment. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless and smiling. "I do not have a ring yet," Quinn admitted. "I wanted to wait until you were ready before I went shopping for one." "I do not need a ring," Zelda said. "I just need you." But Quinn insisted, and the following week he rode into town and returned with a simple gold band set with a small diamond. It was not elaborate, but it was beautiful, and when he slipped it onto her finger, Zelda felt like the luckiest woman alive. They were married in early May in a simple ceremony at the church in Mineral Park. Jake and Eleanor Morrison stood up with them, and a small group of friends and neighbors gathered to witness their vows. It was nothing like Zelda's first wedding, which had been large and elaborate, but it was perfect in its own way. As Zelda stood beside Quinn and spoke her vows, she felt Thomas's presence like a benediction rather than a rebuke. She imagined him smiling down at her, happy that she had found love again, happy that she was moving forward with her life rather than remaining frozen in grief. The reception was held at the hotel, with food and music and dancing that went on late into the evening. Zelda danced with Quinn, with Jake Morrison, with several of the ranch hands who had cleaned up for the occasion. She laughed more than she had in years, felt more alive than she had thought possible. That night, Zelda and Quinn returned to the rocking queue as husband and wife. Quinn carried her over the threshold of the ranch house, and they finally came together as partners in every sense of the word. It was both familiar and new, comfortable and exciting, and when Zelda fell asleep in Quinn's arms, she felt completely at peace for the first time since Thomas's death. The first year of their marriage was not without its challenges. There were disagreements about how to run the ranch, arguments about money and priorities, moments of frustration when they both felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work required to keep the operation running. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything manageable. Quinn taught Zelda how to ride better, how to read the weather, how to tell when a cow was about to calve. Zelda taught Quinn how to manage the household budget, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to plan for the lean times that inevitably came. They learned to work together, to rely on each other's strengths, to support each other through weaknesses. In the fall of their first year of marriage, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a complicated mixture of joy and grief-joy for the child she and Quinn were creating together. Grief, because she could not help thinking about the children she and Thomas had planned to have, but never got the chance to create. Quinn understood, as he always did. "It is all right to feel sad," he told her, holding her close. "This does not erase what you lost. It is just a different chapter." The pregnancy was difficult. Zelda was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. Quinn hovered over her anxiously, bringing her tea and crackers, rubbing her back when the nausea was particularly bad. As her belly grew, so did his excitement, and Zelda found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, despite her physical discomfort. Their son was born in late May of 1884, almost exactly 2 years after Zelda's wedding to Quinn. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Zelda feared she would not survive it. But finally, after 18 hours of labor, Jacob Thomas Quinn entered the world with a lusty cry that could probably be heard in town. Zelda wept when the doctor placed her son in her arms, overcome with a love so fierce it took her breath away. Quinn sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand gently touching his son's tiny fingers. "Jacob Thomas," he said softly, understanding immediately the significance of the name. "Tommy, for short. Is that all right?" Zelda asked, suddenly worried that honoring her first husband might hurt Quinn. "It is more than all right," Quinn said, kissing her forehead. "Thomas was part of your story, part of what made you who you are. It is right that we honor his memory." Little Tommy was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Quinn was besotted with him from the first moment, and watching the big tough cowboy cradling his tiny son made Zelda fall in love with him all over again. The first few months of Tommy's life were exhausting but wonderful. Zelda had help from some of the ranch wives who lived nearby, women who had seemed standoffish when she first arrived at the rocking queue, but who had gradually accepted her as one of their own. They brought food, showed her tricks for soothing a fussy baby, shared their own stories of motherhood. Quinn was as involved a father as his work would allow. He would come in from the range and immediately wash up so he could hold his son, would pace the floor in the middle of the night when Tommy was fussy, would sit beside Zelda's chair and simply watch her nurse the baby, with an expression of such love and wonder that it brought tears to her eyes. As Tommy grew from infant to baby to toddler, the rocking queue continued to prosper. Quinn's hard work and careful planning paid off, and the ranch became one of the more successful operations in the area. They were able to hire more men, expand the herd, make improvements to the property. The ranch house was enlarged, with new bedrooms added and a proper kitchen built. Zelda threw herself into making the ranch house a real home. She planted a garden, sewed curtains for the windows, filled the rooms with books and pictures, and all the small touches that transformed a building into a place of warmth and love. She had never been happier, had never felt more fulfilled. When Tommy was 2, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and their daughter was born in the winter of 1886. They named her Emily Rose Quinn Emily for Quinn's first wife, Rose for Zelda's mother. Quinn held his daughter with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the gift of this second child. "I never thought I would have this again," he whispered to Zelda. "A family, children, a home. Thank you for giving me this." "We gave it to each other," Zelda corrected gently, because that was the truth. They had each been broken by loss, had each believed their chance at happiness was over. But together they had built something new and beautiful. had created a family that honored the past while embracing the future. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. Tommy grew into a sturdy boy who loved helping his father with the cattle, who could ride almost before he could walk. Emily was a quieter child, more inclined to stay near her mother, to help in the garden, to sit for hours with a book. When Tommy was 7 and Emily was 5, Zelda became pregnant one more time. This baby was another boy, born in the early spring of 1889. They named him Samuel, for no one in particular, just because they both liked the name. 3 children made for a busy household. There were school lessons to supervise, meals to cook, clothes to mend, endless questions to answer. But Zelda loved every chaotic moment of it. This was the life she had dreamed of when she married Thomas, the future they had planned together, but never got to realize. And while she sometimes felt a pang of sadness that Thomas was not there to see these children, she was grateful beyond measure that she had been given a second chance at this kind of happiness. Quinn was an excellent father, patient and loving, but firm when necessary. He taught Tommy and Samuel to work cattle, to respect the land, to treat everyone with dignity regardless of their station in life. He was gentle with Emily, encouraging her love of learning, buying her books from catalogs, teaching her to see her own worth in a world that often undervalued women. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the ranch work was done, Quinn and Zelda would sit on the porch the way they had in those early days of their courtship. They would talk about the children, about the ranch, about their hopes for the future. And sometimes, when the mood was right, Zelda would talk about Thomas, sharing memories that were now tinged with fondness rather than overwhelming grief. "Do you think he would approve?" she asked Quinn one evening, 15 years into their marriage. "Of the life I have built, the choices I have made?" Quinn reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I think he would be grateful that you found happiness again. I think he would look at our children and be glad that you did not let grief destroy you. And I think he would know that you never forgot him, that he still holds a place in your heart." It was true. Thomas did still hold a place in Zelda's heart, but it no longer ached the way it once had. Time and love and the building of a new life had softened the edges of her grief, had transformed it from something that consumed her to something she could carry without being crushed by its weight. As their children grew into young adults, as the ranch continued to thrive, as they grew older together, Zelda and Quinn built a life that was rich with meaning and purpose. They survived droughts and hard winters, weathered economic downturns and personal setbacks, celebrated triumphs both large and small. Tommy eventually took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, showing the same dedication and work ethic as his father. Emily surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher, opening a small school in Mineral Park that served the children of ranchers and miners alike. Samuel, the youngest, had a gift with horses and became known throughout Arizona as someone who could gentle even the most fractious animal. When Quinn and Zelda's 30th wedding anniversary arrived in 1914, their children threw them a party that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the territory. Zelda looked around at the crowded room, at the faces of people she had come to love, at the children and grandchildren that surrounded her, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought back to that terrible day in July of 1882, when Thomas had been killed and she had believed her life was effectively over. She remembered the darkness of that grief, the way it had consumed her, the belief that she would never feel happiness again. And she marveled at how wrong she had been, at how impossible it would have seemed then that she could end up here, surrounded by so much love and joy. Quinn found her standing by the window, looking out at the Arizona sunset that painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "About how far we have come," Zelda said, leaning into him. "About how you saved me when I was drowning in grief. About how grateful I am for every day we have had together." "You saved yourself," Quinn corrected gently. "I just gave you a reason to keep going." "We saved each other," Zelda said, because that was closer to the truth. They had both been broken by loss, had both believed their stories were over, but together they had written a new story, one filled with love and family and the quiet satisfaction of building something that would last. As the party continued around them, as their children laughed and their grandchildren played, Quinn and Zelda stood together watching the sunset, their hands linked, their hearts full. They had both loved and lost before finding each other, had both traveled through the valley of grief to reach the other side, And while they would never forget those they had lost, while Thomas and Emily and little Sarah would always be part of their stories, they had learned that the human heart had room for multiple loves, that honoring the past did not mean abandoning the future. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of purple and pink. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows. But whatever came, they would face it together. Two people who had found their way back from grief to build a life more beautiful than either had imagined possible. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not that they had avoided pain or loss, but that they had chosen to keep living despite it, had chosen love over fear, had chosen to write the next chapter instead of closing the book forever. And in doing so, they had created something precious and lasting, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone.